I would like to present today's discussion. So we start from, well, today we have an online seminar. It's we named it after the book of Ambassador Rajendra Abhyankar. We have an online presentation of his book Syria, the tragedy of a pivotal state. Ambassador Abhyankar, among the most distinguished experts on the Syrian field, he served in Syria for a number of years. He is a retired ambassador of the Republic of India to the Syrian Arab Republic in the 90s, and then we can talk a lot about decades of Ambassador Abhyankar, serving within the system of the Indian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Currently, he is the professor of practice of diplomacy and public affairs at O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs of Indiana University in the US. So I would like to thank all of us today being at this seminar. The event will be broadcasted on the is broadcasted on the RIAC YouTube channel and Facebook page. We would like to start our today's discussion with the presentation of Ambassador and his book. Ambassador, you can start. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy that the Russian International Affairs Council has been able to organize this discussion. I'm also very happy to have two experts, Dr. Klebnikov and Dr. Matev, who will contribute and I'm sure add to my knowledge of Syria. Let me start by saying that this is the 10th year of the Syrian Civil War, the unending civil war, more or less. Of course, the most immediate and visual impact, the 11 million Syrians, 5.5 million of whom are refugees outside, and about 6 million of whom are displaced within the country. Most of the people who are refugees, primarily about 3 million, are in Turkey, then in Jordan and Lebanon. But of course, they're all hoping that somehow they'll get into Europe, which is quite impossible to happen. Meanwhile, of course, the ones in Turkey are being used by President Erdogan, both to get some funds out of the European Union, but also to use it for his military operations in the only province that is still not under Bashar Assad's control, which is Idlib, and of course, Afrin. So the estimate for reconstructing the country is estimated between 250 billion to 350 billion. It may change, but that's about a huge amount of money that will. Now, what is so important about Syria? First is that every major power, 4 out of the 5 P5 members, UN Security Council permanent members, are on the ground in Syria. Plus, all the major regional powers are there. So in that sense, it provides a most interesting situation where all these countries are there with complete disregard of the traditional and accepted cardinal rules of the United Nations of non-interference, of respect for national sovereignty, and the right of individual and collective self-defense. In fact, I would like to say here that Russia is the only country which has actually been keeping to the strict norm of non-intervention in each time that the Syrian issue has come up in the Security Council. So that's the first thing, that the global implications of this conflict are such that it will have a major impact on the international system, which itself, the international system that was set up after the Second World War, is in a churn, is changing. And what happens in Syria will have an important uh, repercussion for what the new international order would be, or when it would be. The second is that what is happening in Syria is a hybrid religious war, in the sense that there is both ideological conflict, as seen from from what Saudi Arabia and Iran are doing in Syria, but it is also on the ground. So it represents the evolution, or rather the resurrection of two very fundamental issues within Islam itself, which are being fought on the ground in Syria. Historically, actually, Syria has been known to provide the ground, or provide the battleground, for opposing forces of different kinds. If one goes through right from the time of the Crusades till today, Syria has always been providing a battleground for different parties to come and settle their quarrels. In recent times, you have you have issues between Israel and Hezbollah, between Iran and Israel, between US and Iran, and of course between US and Russia. All these issues are taking place at the same time. But the factual mad situation is that so far as we can see, Bashar Assad, after 10 years, has been able to win back nearly 90% of his country and about 70% of its population. The battle still goes on since, I think, September 2018 in the province of Idlib, where Turkey has gone back on its commitments to isolate the terrorist group, the HTS, and in fact is using that as a possibility of actually getting a voice in Syria's future as well. So it is strange whether, I mean, it needs to be seen whether this is some kind of a new um, paradigm for a world war, where all the major world powers and regional powers come on a common battlefield, and so which is with a combination both of interstate wars and intrastate wars. But this we will know how much it how it progresses in the future. But there is a trend, or it could be a trend. Now, why is Syria so important? Of course, I don't need to tell you who are experts that the country has nurtured three great religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It also sits astride the civilizational confluence of four cultures: the Arab, the Persian, the Turk, and the Hebrew. Then Syria itself is a country of minorities. It is a mosaic of ethnically, culturally, and religiously distinct communities who have all come together to breed a kind of secular and tolerant culture, which is not seen anywhere in the Arab world these days. Of course, the conflict itself has taken on many different dimensions. Apart from nearly at the height of the conflict, nearly 1,000 terrorist groups of different kinds who were funded by different powers, there has been sectarian strife and socioeconomic grievances, which have also been responsible for the situation that we see today. There's also a conflict between the more privileged and richer people and those who are marginalized or marginalized communities. But the real issue in all this is that by making religious belief a primary identity marker, the country has put itself in a dilemma of maintaining sectarian diversity while at the same time preserving national unity. This kind of a conflict you find in today in a number of countries taking place, perhaps even in India. Now, why did Assad survive? Firstly, the Baath party structure is an efficient state structure. I mean, it was geared to ensure that the powers that be remain there. Secondly, there's a non-politicized army which Bashar Assad got from Hafiz Assad. Third has been Bashar Assad's ability to outplay regional and international enemies by changing his alliances, as he did with Qatar and Saudi Arabia. He has been very much alive to the changing dynamics in the region itself. The next is that in everything that Assad has done, he has tried to emphasize the sovereignty of the country, most importantly in the area of humanitarian assistance, where he has ensured that all aid that comes into Syria goes through the state agencies. Now, this is a double-edged weapon, of course. On the one hand, it emphasizes its sovereignty, but on the other, it also ensures that those who are against him don't get the humanitarian assistance. But that's what he's fighting for, his survival. He has also been able thereby to exploit the ethnic and sectarian fault lines within the country and in the region. The Arab Baath Socialist Party, which has become the key instrument, has become a major instrument of the state control of the economy, the policy, and the society. So coming back, how did we get here? The simplest way of saying it is that when the infamous or famous Arab Spring reached Syria in March 2011, it ensured that it failed in Syria, mainly because of the heavy-handed action taken by the governor of the province there. But it also failed, not just in Syria, but if we see even the revival of the Arab Spring in 2019 in Sudan and Algeria, it continues to fail because those who are fighting, and very correctly fighting for a voice in the governance of the country, have no real agenda, have no leadership, and have no goals. So in such a situation, the Arab Spring didn't become an Arab Spring, but became a winter. The only place where it succeeded was in Egypt, where, of course, for the first time there was a open election without any problems. But then it was the people themselves who went and ensured that the Muslim Brotherhood did not get power or did not keep power. So in the end, the army in most of these countries has become the arbiter of the future of the country. In this, in the entire period of 10 years, an important factor has been the use of chemical weapons. Although in 2016, the OPCW actually destroyed all the chemical weapon stocks of Syria, in the end, they have continued to be used. It's mainly chlorine. And as of the end of 2018, I could get figures for 350 recorded incidents of the use of chemical weapons, mainly chlorine, by both sides. In fact, as far as Syria is concerned, I think the use of chemical weapons has become a part of their formula for fighting to soften the people who are involved. Now, coming to the most important part of the entire thing, our dimension is the foreign interference. Now, we have France, United Kingdom, US, and Russia on the ground. We have Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey, and then, of course, there are some others, but these are the more important ones. Only Russia and Iran with, of course, Hezbollah, are the ones who are there at the invitation of the Syrian government. whereas all others have entered without any interest or with no interest in trying to ensure that any of the UN principles are maintained. They've all been backing different groups, Qatar especially. Turkey, of course, is there in some kind of a neo-Ottomanism in order to, with the aim of creating a buffer zone in the area of Idlib, where they want to resettle 2 million of the 3 million refugees. Saudi Arabia is there because it is aware that its own regime is frail. And then you have the issue of the Shia-Sunni conflict in Syria, because Syria, unlike Iraq, is majority Sunni, and the Alawites, who are a branch of the Shia, are ruling. As far as the United States is concerned, basically Presidents Obama and Trump have had the same idea, that is to have a low-key operation, because they have not considered that Syria is vital to the security of the United States. But as far as President Trump was concerned, they both have actually been keen to target the ISIS and finish it off, and to ensure that there is no use of chemical weapons by Assad and the Syrian army. While Obama drew a number of red lines, he didn't keep to that, but President Trump has had 2 attacks on the Syrian army and other positions, each time that they used chemical weapons. ISIS, of course, on the ground, it would appear that ISIS is more or less over. As an organization which had such a vast stretch of both Iraq and Iran, the ground. But that doesn't mean that ISIS is actually over, because they have gone back to their earlier agenda of a missionary sort of agenda, which is to convert people to its idea of an Islamic state. So this is the issue that I'm happy to discuss more. As far as the United Nations is concerned, it has been involved with trying to bring peace to Syria ever since 2012 and the Annan and the Lakhdar Brahimi efforts. But eventually what we do have is the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2254 of 2015, which has been unanimously adopted by the Security Council, and which is supposed to lead to a Syrian-owned, a Syrian-led peace process to build a credible, inclusive, and non-sectarian country in that non-sectarian framework. If you compare it with Afghanistan, where there's only the UN there, and NATO, sorry, and Iraq, where there is no unanimous Security Council resolution, at least what has happened in Syria shows that there is some progress. The discussions on 2254 have been going on ever since, and I should say that they have led to a fair amount of progress in different aspects dealing with the Syrian situation. In the end, of course, what we do have is that despite all this, we still do not have a durable ceasefire. Without that, there is nothing that we can do. So for a post-war scenario, what we need to have is a de-escalation and an enduring ceasefire, a way in which the refugees can return back to their homes, and the internally displaced as well. In each of these, there are problems on the ground. Then, of course, the question of rebuilding hospitals, roads, schools, buildings, there's a huge amount of work. But apart from all this, on top of all this, what is needed is a viable political structure which will ensure for the Syrians some kind of a participation in the country. Now, what can be done? What are the solutions that I feel can be tried out? To use the 1960 Treaty of Guarantee on Cyprus, which guarantees, which is signed by Cyprus, Greece, Turkey, and UK, and this is the 1960 treaty, which guarantees the existence of Cyprus. On a similar kind of model, if there was a guaranteeing treaty signed by all the permanent members of the Security Council as guarantors about what they should be, what it should contain. There are, of course, problems. There are problems about the Sunnis. They will need a special place in the special recognition in any constitution. And what I would say is that the first thing is therefore a drafting effort to draft a new constitution, for which many efforts have been made. But there are certain guidelines that they have to think of. I mean, the basic documents are, of course, the Syrian Constitution of 1950 and 2012. The Egyptian Constitution, I feel, is relevant in 2014, and the Turkish Constitution of 1982. Then there has to be a system of election which will be a multi-party, but it will also include the Arab Baath Socialist Party. The mistake made in Iraq by cancelling out the ABSP cannot be done. Then there's something called the consociational democracy, which will allow passions to cool before a more broad-based system can be established. General elections, again, on a proportional basis, using the Turkish formula of a minimum percentage of votes for each party to be represented in parliament. Then a prime ministerial system with limited powers for the president, including the ability to declare a national emergency. Secularism, therefore, will have to be a principle of the state which divides clearly between religious and political authority. Constitutional guarantees will be required for all minorities, both Islamic and non-Islamic, and a special status for the Alawites, because the greatest fear that the Alawites have is that they're going to be massacred if in the end Assad cannot hold the country. Then there are other things like the security concerns of the people, the return of the missing, the identification of the missing, and those who are in custody, confidence building measures, and reform of police and intelligence services. I'd like to end by mentioning a few points as far as Russia is concerned. Russia's role has been crucial in the entire Syrian situation. Russia entered in 2015 mainly to shore up an old ally, which is Syria, and has always provided strong support. It has been able to establish its ability to play the arbiter at a time when there is no longer, when it's probably not regarded as a superpower, but it does have the ability to act like one. To create, of course, it has been able to create leverages with other powers involved in the Middle East. Even between Iran and Russia, it's two foreign supporters. The Syrian president appears to have a far greater confidence in Russia to be able to control the Iranian desire, for example, to have a permanent presence on the border with the Golan. Of course, then Russia is part of the Astana process, and President Putin's role has been very phenomenal in trying to move that process forward, especially in the whole matter of going district by district, province by province to evacuate and remove the various terrorist groups. I also find that Russia has fully supports the Syrian government and the Syrian army, the Russian army supports on the fight for Idlib, which is endlessly going on for more than a year and a half now. it has also been a good referee between Iran and Israel, because Israel has continued to say that it will attack Iranian positions in Syria so long as they are there. I believe that Russia has a very crucial role now, not only within the P5, within the Security Council, to ensure that there is some way that it can bring up a minimal sort of result of having a durable ceasefire and ushering in a political settlement. So I believe that Russia's role in Syria has been crucial, but will be even more so as we seem to have entered the end game as far as Syria is concerned, and I think it is in here that Russia has an important role to play. Thank you. I think.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. That was a great speech. Many issues you covered in your speech. While I know that there were some questions in your book, particularly that you don't raise now during your speech, but it's because of the timing. I think we can discuss it a bit later. And I actually, you know, while you were presenting your speech, your book, I had more questions to ask you, but we will definitely ask these questions after all speakers, you know, present their own reports. And I would like to join here. I would like to engage Alexei Khlebnikov, who is the expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. Alexei, Ambassador told about the many aspects of the Syrian conflict, a bit about even the history, and there was even the a bit religious background and confessional background of the story. While closer to the end of his speech, Ambassador touched upon the issue of the governmental structure, which is actually about the Syrian settlement in the end. We definitely, we definitely support your, ambassador saying that there is a political process which should be Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, and we mentioned that when we talk about, the principle for the future state, like secular vision for the state, or the Baas party still being there in the any Syrian settlement, we clearly see that this is about political process. This is about discussions among Syrians themselves. As we understand it from Moscow, outsiders, I mean those who are regional players or international players, they should engage with this particular conflict by creating conditions for Syrians themselves to decide on their future. One of these tools is the Constitutional Committee. And most of these issues that, Ambassador, you raised, I think that are discussed within the Constitutional Committee, though this committee is not successful as somebody thought in the very beginning. And definitely Russia was a part of, among those players who, supported this particular issue. But there are many complications of the political settlement and political process. I hope, and here comes my questions to Alexei Khlebnikov. Alexei, could you kindly share with us your view on the current dynamics around Syria and the Syrian political settlement? How do you see this from Moscow? Thank you.
Thank you, Ruslan. And first, let me say thank you to Ambassador Abhyankar to his very, very broad description of an amount of topics he raised in his presentation. And it's this very book is a great contribution to the amount of literature which was released in the last years on this topic. And I think that's a very great addition to this amount of scholarship which was done on this issue. So thank you for that, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Well, if we talk about a political process, Ruslan, answering to your question, Unfortunately, if there will be that easy, political process would come very smoothly and without obstacles, which are actually plenty of them exist there. And here I would like to start with basically dividing the whole conflict into several dimensions, and then briefly talk about each of them, and coming, of course, to the political settlement at its final. So the first dimension, which actually now being paid less attention, it's the military dimension. Despite the intensity of the conflict decreased, it's still actually there. The de facto Turkish occupation of Idlib, North Aleppo, and Northeast Syria, it's a huge issue, which actually leads to that about 20–30% of Syrian territory is still not under the government control. Of course, American presence together with Turkish presence, military presence in Syria is a big issue, and there is no clear answer to how and when this is going to be settled. And without that, any political process makes little sense in terms of the looking for a final solution, final settlement. And Israeli attacks on Iranian and pro-Iranian targets inside Syria and Iranian military entrenchment in the country is another important military aspect, because the presence of the forces which support the government cause another military action from another actor in the region, which also doesn't contribute to any settlement and disregard any constructive attempts to solve it. Then we come to international dimension. That basically over the last years, dynamics, the trend is actually moving in the direction of increasing risks of rising tensions between actors involved in the conflict. There is a higher risk of tensions between Russia and Turkey, Russia and Iran, Russia and the United States, between Turkey, Kurds, and Damascus. So this kind of a constellation of bilateral or multilateral tensions, they now have higher potential for escalation. Then the new US policy. So the new administration will come, and we know it has a slightly different approach, which will mostly affect its policy towards Turkey, towards Syria, and towards Iran. And the way how those policies will be eventually implemented will affect greatly the internal dynamics of the conflict inside Syria, which is very important to monitor. And the future of intra-Arab reconciliation on Syria. That's another crucial part of this international dimension. We've been witnessing over the last couple of years slow but gradual reconciliation between Syria and United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, although it's very limited, but the process already started, and now it's only a matter of time when it will gain the pace and when it will become stronger. Of course, it has a lot of obstacles on its way, but nevertheless, we cannot deny the fact that this reconciliation process has already started. They already have place. Then we come to the socioeconomic dimension of this conflict, which majorly connected to the sanctions, to the destroyed state infrastructures, which greatly diminished states' capacity to deliver services, destabilized socioeconomic situation, raised the problem of food insecurity, and greatly diminished humanitarian situation in the country. The COVID pandemic also contribute now on the top of the mentioned socioeconomic problems. Also, instability in Lebanon, which is ongoing for the last year, also greatly contributed to the Syrian economy. We all know well that Lebanon is also known as to be lungs of the Syrian economy, and that basically, until the situation in Lebanon stabilizes, Syria has little chances to improve its economic and financial stance. And also the lack of reconstruction funds and ability to kickstart the reconstruction process, large-scale reconstruction process, contribute greatly to the very dim socioeconomic situation in the country. And finally, coming to the political dimension of this conflict, we can already, both Ruslan and Ambassador Abhyankar mentioned about this. The lack of progress in Constitutional Committee plays an important role here. And we cannot see any kind of bright prospects of it to produce some final package of agreements which will be actually implemented in reality. And a lot of factors contribute to that, including those which I mentioned from other dimensions, military, international, and socioeconomic. Also, Damascus' inflexibility and inability to strike compromises on political reforms, or even in sending positive signals on outwards to the international Western community in order to somehow ease the sanction burden and improve its, at least prospects for its economic situation. Unfortunately, Damascus is very hard to change its behavior. And here, Moscow, I think one of the biggest challenges for Moscow is how to persuade, not to push, but how to persuade the Syrian government to be more flexible and ready for compromises on this track. And of course, on the political, when we talk about political dimension, we cannot just talk about the Constitutional Committee and all this UN-led process within the Resolution 2254. We also should look at the Kurdish problem, and actually not a single decision of Constitutional Committee which excludes Syrian Kurds cannot contribute to the final status of the conflict settlement. And here, lack of progress in negotiations between Kurds and Damascus, with Russia being one of the facilitators, also contributes to the to this impasse on this track. So I'll probably stop here. I briefly highlighted these important points, and rather focus more on economic problems, issues, which will be covered by Dr. Matveyev. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really very useful. Good summary.
Thank you very much, Alexei. It was many important points covered. I think that we could, talk on them a bit more in the Q&A session after that. Dr. Matveyev, I would like to bring in your speech. I know that you have a PowerPoint presentation, so kindly, we have a question of how the current dynamic around the economic issues influencing the current agenda. What trends do you see in the economic sphere for Syria? Thank you. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Ruslan, and thank you very much for Ambassador Abhyankar for delivering such a wonderful presentation, and hopefully I will have an opportunity to look through your book very attentively. The title of my presentation, very brief presentation, will be Present-Day Economic Challenges for Syria. So I will start from the challenge of the COVID pandemic. So here you can see a table which illustrates the situation with COVID pandemic in Syria in comparison with other neighbor countries like Iraq, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine territories, and Turkey. And you can see here several criteria. And here I would like to say that actually, at the very first glance, the situation in Syria looks so relatively good in comparison to its neighbors. But at the same time, first of all, you can see that rate of infected persons in the total population, with it's much lower in comparison with all other countries. But at the same time, you can see the rate of lethality, which is comparatively higher with other countries, and also a ratio of recoveries indicator, which is also much lower in comparison with other countries. So there are pluses and minuses, objective pluses and minuses in the situation related to the COVID in Syria. First of all, it's some sort of a plus. Syria is a closed sanctioned country with no tourism traffic and low business activity. And also it's the matter of foreign aid, which comes from such countries as China, Russia, the United Arab Emirates, and the UN and other countries. But also there are very huge minuses for the situation. First of all, it's deficit of national and international funding and lack of local medical facilities due to the long-term armed conflict and sanctions. This is very important in order to understand the whole situation with the COVID in Syria. Also, the disruption of Syria's territorial integrity, which means rather weak quarantine measures in the autonomous regions, Kurdish-controlled autonomous regions of North and East Syria, and definitely in Idlib. Also meaning massive informal cross-border movements of individuals through the points which are not run by the Syrian government. Also, reluctance of Syrian patients to seek medical assistance because of their fear of losing their jobs amid huge economic and financial crisis in Syria. Another challenge is about territorial partition of Syria. So here you can see a map which illustrates Syria being divided, and here you can see some at the bottom, some data which illustrates that Syrian authorities now control like about 61.88% of the Syrian territory. In comparison, in June 2019, it was about 58%. And also, you can see that now a rebel control in Idlib is like about 3,000 square kilometers. It was much more, double. It was like about 6,000 square kilometers before the operation of Dawn of Idlib 2. And also, you can see that some of portion of territory has been controlled by US-friendly forces. That's about a Tanaf cross-border point with Iraq. Also about the Israeli occupation of the Golan Heights and Turkey-controlled area, so-called Northern Syria Security Belt, and definitely, as already mentioned, the territory controlled by Syrian Democratic Forces. Which is what is important. You can look to your right and see two other small maps. The first illustrates that, and you can just compare them with the bigger map to your left, and you can easily see that mainly resources, mineral resources, oil, are controlled by the Kurds. It's easily seen by this map. And also the bottom to your right, you can see another map which illustrates major agricultural regions of Syria, which are mainly not also controlled by the government. This is very important to understand the situation, the real situation in the Syrian economy. Another challenge is the challenge of parallel economies. So here I would like to mention that there are three parallel economies now after the defeat of ISIS. So it's economy of the Kurdish-run autonomous territories of the north and the east. Also economy of northern Syria, official control by the Syrian interim government located in Azaz. That's the Aleppo governorate province, and also economy of Idlib, which officially controlled by the Syrian Salvation government. So you can see some pictures here on the map, which also illustrate the use of currencies there. So it's also a challenge for the Syrian economy because in different parts of Syria, different currencies are being used in addition with the Syrian pound. I would like to mention in the Kurdish areas, that's US dollar, and two other parallel economies, it's Syrian pound coexists with the Turkish lira. And another interesting information provided by UN OCHA, you can see on the smaller picture, illustrates the lack and deficit of access of the Syrian government towards the borders, which also produces a challenge not only in terms of the COVID pandemic, but also in terms of the trade turnover, a gray and black algorithm for trade, and etc., which also badly affects the whole social economic situation in Syria. Here we come to another challenge of the Caesar Act, and here to your left you can see the map which illustrates the main geographical dimensions of these secondary US sanctions. You can see easily see the names of the countries here depicted here, and you can see that it's a very wide scope, and the first instant negative impact in comparison with the previous so-called paper sanctions, when the US was just filling paper lists, imposing some bans of money being in the US banks and etc. Now the sanctions are real, and they're hindering perspectives of foreign investments in the reconstruction of Bashar al-Assad Syria, and also at the same time creating a fuel deficit in Syria. And this fact was really acknowledged recently by the Syrian government, and also at the same time provoking a considerable rise in prices for imported main goods and foodstuffs. But that badly affects the living standards of the population. What are the major risks for violators of these US sanctions? First of all, criminal prosecution in the US. So if the US authorities see that somebody or some company or some individual just pressing US individuals or companies in order to bypass sanctions in their context with the Syrian business counterparts, that means that they can be prosecuted inside the US. And it's also at the same time denying access to the American financial system. But definitely it means not just only denying access to the American financial system, but really denying access to all transfers in US dollars, and also a risk for international companies and individuals for becoming scapegoats in trade wars of the US against competitors. That's more about the countries which already had imposed sanction regimes against Syria, like Japan or Republic of Korea, and definitely the EU. But in some cases, the US can play with the secondary sanctions to impose restrictions against their counterparts, violating trade rules in order just to protect themselves in their trade wars against their competitors. Now we come to another challenge of the current crisis in Lebanon. So first of all, I would like to say that it's hindering Syrian imports from Lebanon, and particularly from using the Lebanon as a transit point, a transit hub for trade with the Arab Gulf, and especially after August 4, 2020 explosions in the seaport of Beirut, whereas Syrian traders lost a lot of their goods. And also at the same time, the Lebanese crisis has been provoking a sharp rise in prices for foodstuffs and other imported goods in Syria as a result of higher sanctions risks and rise costs of logistics, insurance, and etc. And it's worth mentioning here that alternative import routes, either via the northern Lebanese port of Tripoli or through Latakia, Tartus, look very problematic, first due to the sanctions and also due to their limited technical capacities. Also, depriving Syria, the Lebanese crisis has been depriving Syrians of the use of the Lebanese banking system, which is crucial in terms of losing the access to the deposits. And there is a lot of information now about the Syrian deposits in Lebanon exceeding $40 billion US, and at the same time also denying access to Lebanese credits and money transfers due to the mounting financial crisis in Lebanon. This is not only about the sanctions. At the same time, making Lebanon very vulnerable to foreign pressure in terms of the Caesar Act, because the country drastically needs foreign assistance, especially from foreign international monetary organizations, and also speeding up inflation inside Syria upon the depreciation of the national currency. Here on the slide, you can see some figures about the price of Syrian pound at the black market, and the reduction of this price during the first 8 months of this year, amid the official rate being like about 520 Syrian pounds per US dollar, as also as a result of cutting remittances from abroad and banking transfers. Also, the Lebanese crisis has been undermining Lebanon's ambitions to become a real empty hub for Syria's economic reconstruction. And also at the same time, it's like a growing social burden for the Syrian economy due to the massive return of Syrian refugees from Lebanon. Here you can see the challenge of vague perspectives of rebuilding Syria. Here you can see this table comparative analysis between Syria and other states like Kuwait, Lebanon, Iraq, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. You can see that the perspectives of the reconstruction in Syria are unclear, and the country lacks revenues, massive revenues from oil and gas or banks, and also lacks international consensus on the reconstruction, and also faces territorial partition and the ongoing armed conflict. So that means that places Syria in very unfavorable condition in comparison to other Arab countries. So what are the international approaches, very briefly, towards Syria's reconstruction and humanitarian aid? So about the US, go direct, it means bypassing Damascus, go local, go small, and go slow. The whole of Syria approach for delivering humanitarian aid, which is about the UN. And also early recovery projects, concentrating on early recovery projects in Syria. That's about the UN, which works in cooperation with member states like Japan and Germany. And also helping Syrian refugees in neighbor states. That's about the EU donor assistance and Brussels donor conferences. And also using Syrian expats like the Czech Republic and other Eastern Europeans do. Take, for example, this Arados successful project in Syria, which was executed successfully in summer 2017, and also using Syrian Lebanese intermediaries by Arab countries like Egypt, or countries from Organization of Islamic Cooperation like Malaysia and Indonesia. And also it's about direct but limited economic and financial aid coming from Iran, China, and Russia. And the last, challenge of the domestic economic crisis. So very briefly, I would like just to name it. Very narrow national resources for financing Syria's economic reconstruction amidst the ongoing armed conflict and amidst generally passive attitudes of the local private sector. Also, the disruption of territorial integrity, as already told you, as a major obstacle for the recovery of economic and social life. Also, general negative impact of mounting anti-Syrian sanctions, already told you, and lack of international consensus on the issue of investments and rebuilding Bashar al-Assad's Syria, as was illustrated one more time by 11-12 November conference on refugees in Damascus, conducted with the assistance of the Russian Federation, and also with Iran limiting seriously limited donor aid because of its own economic crisis. But here I'm rather optimistic because there could have been some improvements in case, because Joe Biden would probably choose another policy toward Iran. But for Russia, that's not a very good piece of news, because that would possibly lead to more competition, economic competition between Russia and Iran inside Syria. Also, would like to mention slow dynamics of the Syrian peace process as an obstacle for financing Syria's reconstruction, and its growing dependence on imports due to the low national production capacities. Also would like to mention the ongoing inflation and the depreciation of the national currency because of sanctions, domestic economic problems, and the current crisis in Lebanon. And also overall negative impact of the Lebanese crisis and COVID pandemic. Also, it's very important to mention here that already led to some rise of social protests inside Syria, inspired by the deterioration of human life standards. For instance, I would like to mention here massive rallies, protest rallies in As-Suwaida, before it was a rather peaceful and loyal region for the Syrian authorities in Suwaida, that's in southern Syria, which already happened in January, June, and November this year. And also would like to mention a national cataclysm, forest fires in the coastal areas of Syria in autumn this year. And also, it's very important to mention here the turmoil inside the Syrian business elite groups provoked by an anti-corruption campaign carried out by the Syrian authorities, but at the same time, its real goal seems to be not only about the fighting corruption, but also about consolidating national resources for rebuilding the country. And here I would like to mention a Rami Makhlouf affair. And finally, I would like to mention here like urban terrorism hindering business activities. You can look and find some information about that in internet, about killing like Mufti of Damascus, and some other terrorist acts, because Syria is still familiar with these tragic events. Thank you very much for your attention, and I will be ready to answer any of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matveyev. Well, we had, I think, very interesting reports and very interesting presentation of Ambassador. I hope that we will start our discussion. And actually, I would like to return to the presentation of Ambassador Abhyankar of his book. You know, ambassadors, there is one quote I would like to mention from your book, if I may. You wrote that, I mean, speaking about the reconstruction and rebuilding issues, you wrote in your book, because, you know, just now Dr. Matveyev mentioned how it is important for Syria to gain that, and you in your presentation mentioned that Assad even could, you know, use somewhere these particular issues and money sent to Syria to his favor. You wrote that, quote, rebuilding could make daily life livable and enable refugees to return. The challenge is that reconstruction is not just about roads and bridges. It enables the Assad government to assert its power through a deeply political process. End of quote. I would like to ask you, how do you see the future of the particular reconstruction process in Syria? We understand that it's much to depend on Syrian government, but this is one of the important points when we talk about the future settlement, and it's somehow used by the Western, European and American analytical community, diplomats and others, as a tool in discussions with Assad, in pressuring him or something like that. While till today, he had an interesting answer to all of these people trying to pressure him. So my question is divided into two, if I may. First is when you say about the need to plan for a future political map of the country's governance, you also wrote it in the book, that we need a new governance for Syria. How do you see the flexibility of Bashar Assad even in the future, or what conditions should be made by outside players, by regional and external players, for the government in Damascus, the current government in Damascus, go for, you know, discussions about the future governance? Because for now, as we understand, the government in Damascus, you know, they refuse to discuss such kind of issues, or try to, you know, avoid such kind of discussions. And second question here, because of, you know, in your book, you make it in parallel. You say that we need a future political map for the country, for the country's governance, and you wrote, you know, later you wrote, in parallel, we need an international humanitarian assistance process. That was in your book. So for that, I also, my second question here comes is, what role do you see for external actors in this particular process of international humanitarian assistance, and especially for India, because you worked for Indian foreign ministers there in Damascus. So how do you see the prospects for future role for future Indians humanitarian assistance process? And, you know, maybe you could also touch upon, I mean, a little talk about the future of India-Syria relations.
Thank you very much. Let me start by saying that, of course, humanitarian assistance is going to be needed. And as we saw from the presentations by Dr. Matveyev and Dr. Klebnikov, that there is a tremendous need for it. The real problem here is none of the things that are equally important, like having a sound political structure which is agreed, which ensures that there is a proper distribution of whatever finances come in from the international sources for reconstructing the country. The real problem is Assad. The problem here is that now that he has, well, I must say that we have now a specific figure of 61.88% of the territory which President Assad controls, or which the Syrian government controls. He is, of course, hopeful that there will be some kind of a closure to the Idlib situation in his favor, thanks to the Russians. But the real issue is that he is increasingly coming to the view that, well, I have succeeded, I have won. So when you think of this kind of an attitude, the ability that Mr. Assad has to negotiate or to soften his position, whether it is on how you're going to actually disburse the financial assistance that will come. Because presently we have seen that some reconstruction has started in areas or in provinces which Assad is very sure that he's controlling. There has been a studied way in which his cronies, especially Rami Makhlouf and others, have been given the ability to develop huge colonies around Damascus, especially, and as a result, many of the refugees who are coming back are finding that their homes are no longer theirs. So this is a very negative sign as far as the reconstruction funds are concerned. And I think that will have an important effect on those who are even disposed to give these funds, mainly the European countries, because as far as the European countries are concerned, I think virtually all of them, whether it is France or whether it is UK or any of them, they have come to the point that we can live with Assad, at least for some time. So now the only thing they have in their hands is the money that is available for reconstruction. So in the end, if this can be somehow brought together, it is a question of a bargain between how long Assad can remain as an executive president of the country and the release of these funds. So that, I think, answers your first point, that it is really now up to Assad and his desire to actually see that something is done. I think here, I may be wrong, but here Assad seems to be sort of confident that he will get these funds from China and from Russia, which is doubtful in my view, that he can get this magnitude of funds from only these two countries. We found that in the Damascus Fair, which has started, he has given contracts. Contracts have been given to firms from these countries. But this is not the end of the story. There is going to be a vast amount of money required, and it will have to come from the Western countries. So the bargain is there. Now, as far as the humanitarian assistance is concerned, there is no doubt. I mean, it makes it very difficult to say. Of course, there's a huge amount of people who need humanitarian assistance. But when I put the Syrian situation today and compare it with the situation in Yemen, then I don't know which one needs more urgent humanitarian assistance, because it is equally bad. In fact, maybe it's worse in Yemen. But anyway, as far as Syria is concerned, international humanitarian assistance is coming, will come, but there are two issues here. One is that the Syrian government, of course, insists that all international humanitarian assistance is channeled through its own agencies and not directly by the agency that is bringing in the thing. Now, this has been a very negative factor for a good number of agencies, including, for example, Oxfam, which said, well, we can't do that. We have to give it to where we want. Now, there is a UN Security Council resolution, I think, which will start operating in January, when actually when this will become very difficult for agencies to go beyond or outside the Syrian government framework to give humanitarian assistance. So while the Syrian government's position is understandable up to a point, because they are using humanitarian assistance as an assertion of its sovereignty, but it is also a problem because the government agencies, whoever the government, government agency that distributes this assistance will always continue to play favorites, which means people who are even remain opposed to the government are not going to get this assistance. This is a problem, and I really don't see what the solution can be to this unless there is some way that President Assad is made to moderate his positions. Thank you. Have I answered your questions, or did I lose something?
Thank you. There was also one point you didn't mention. I would like to restate my question, if I may. There was a question of international humanitarian assistance, but also the Indian approach to it.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. I would like to mention that still Assad is, as you said, and I think that you rightly said, Assad for all these years had an ability to, as you said, outplay the regional actors and players, and still he is there. So and the issue of sovereignty, when we talk about sovereignty and international recognition or something like that, still there are some points in the international affairs that many countries share. Among them, Russia and India. We share the opinion of non-interference and strict obedience to the international norms, international law, etc., etc. And here comes the question, and the issue of sovereignty. And here comes the question. India has maintained good ties to Damascus through all out of war. It never suspended its embassies there, and still perceived by Syrians as the partners or future potential partners. Again, and we know that there were many projects of India in Syria, and even in the oil sector. Do you see that India will have or at least consider some more active engagement with Syria in the future, especially, for example, after 2021 elections in Syria, when Bashar Assad is actually going to, as far as I understand, he's going to win those elections. Yeah. And at least he will be a candidate for this for the presidency. So how do you assess this Indian angle? Because it's very important for Moscow to understand also this, to how the dynamics is going on.
Well, the Indian angle, as far as Syria is concerned, is that we have always maintained that Syria remains our friend. We have never taken a hostile position against President Assad and his government. Secondly, as far as the COVID is concerned, India has been able to send, masks and various materials to Syria for dealing with the COVID situation there. But as Professor Matthias showed, that compared to other Arab countries, the Syrian position is not as bad as it looks. India has always, when it is actually, India was in the non-permanent member of the Security Council in 2012, 2013. At that time, it always took positions on whenever Syria came up, to ensure that nothing would be done which would involve any kind of a regime change in Syria. Now, actually, starting January, India will again be a non-permanent member of the Security Council for the next 2 years. And this is going to be a very crucial period for Syria, because in spite of the fact that we are not seeing great positive signs, I do believe that the entire situation in Syria is winding down. I mean, it can be assisted to wind down. There is no better time than now to do it. But in any case, I think these next 2 years, 21 and 22, will be important as far as Syria and its entire repercussions, not only within the country, but outside the country, would come up in the Security Council. And there, Russia will always find a very active and supportive partner as far as India is concerned. But not being a permanent member, there's very little more that we can do. And of course, we have not been asked, but India remains ready to provide assistance of whatever kind that is required as far as the Syrians are concerned. So that is our position. We have, in a broad sense, in the Middle East, our major problem also is that if the Syrian situation goes on, the Syrian situation has become centrifugal. I mean, a lot of things that are happening in Syria could have an effect on other countries in the Middle East. Now, we have nearly 7 million Indians working in the Middle East. So for us, it is important to understand what is going on so that we can take any kind of an action that is required as far as our Indian population working in those countries is concerned, because they still remain Indian citizens. So here we have tried, and we have been reasonably successful to talk to the Syrians on how do they see it, because the Syrians are very good observers of what is going on in that whole area. So this is another aspect of our concern and our interest in what goes on in Syria.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Talking about the ability to, again, coming back to the Bashar Assad's staying in power and his presidency, Alexei, if I may, I have a question to you and your presentation. We never talked about, I mean, seriously, the future of the political discussions. We understand the complexities of it, we understand it, and you said obstacles toward this political process. But do you see that at least partially there is a possible activization of the political process in Syria after the elections in 2021? Do you think it could be coming? And if yes, Alexei, do you think that that could bring some results in the political process?
Well, I think after 2021, meaning after the election, and once Bashar Assad is installed once again and maybe is there for the next 5 years, I think we may be in a better, the prognosis may be more positive in being able to get some political restructuring done in that country. Of course, I mean, the question remains that it will have to be done in a way in which, firstly, it is not possible to just throw Bashar Assad out. We are going to have to slowly ease him out. So it will have to be a bargain between how long he can stay and with what powers. And then slowly then we look at how it can be done. But hopefully, and I think here the greatest impact on Assad will be the Russian impact, because Russia has been totally supportive of Assad and has the right to claim a certain amount of flexibility on the part of Assad. While after all, it was Russian persuasion that allowed, that enabled, let's say, or that made it possible for Assad to give up his chemical weapons. It would not have happened without Russian persuasion. So in a similar way, I think there is a very strong possibility if proper pressure can be brought on Assad from the proper quarters.
Thank you very much. Ambassador, could I ask also Alexei Khlebnikov? Dr. Khlebnikov, could you also answer the same question, if I may?
Sure, definitely. The next year, 21 presidential elections will be a sort of a milestone for the future behavior of the Syrian government and President Bashar al-Assad. But in general, I don't see how it can greatly contribute or change the existing status quo in political settlement track. And one of the biggest obstacles here, and I also wanted to throw this into our discussion, the problem of the refugees and their coming back, their return to Syria. We actually have basically today in 2020, there is 17.6 million Syrians live in Syria, so current population of the country. On top of that, it's about 6.5 million refugees residing outside of Syria. So basically only about 11 million Syrians live under the government control, which actually makes this the less than half of the entire population, regardless of where it is residing today in Syria or outside Syria. So that also puts into the question the legitimacy of the next 21 elections, where Assad will be elected by the minority of the Syrians, basically. So, and that will also serve as a very big obstacle, serious obstacle for the process of refugees' return into the country. So, and unless something is done on this track, again, the political settlement will be a very hard issue to see the progress in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Alexei. Dr. Matveyev, I also had a question to you, if I may. We talked about the sanctions regime of now of Syria and COVID-19 influencing the Syrian economy. But there is also another question of, do you think that we could look a bit for a future? We see that there is a new administration in the US, and the Biden administration is trying to change at least, or at least they say it in the rhetoric, but they're trying to change something in their, for example, Iran policy. Do you think that Iran being back on board and taking opportunity to, sell their own oil when the U.S. administration, the new U.S. administration, Biden administration will lift at least partially some sanctions? Do you think that that could give Iranians more opportunities to support their Syrian ally, or they will be concentrated on themselves? As far as we understand, Syria is an important factor in Iranian foreign policy. Do you think that there will be more funds for foreign policy for Iranians and on Syria? And do you think that sanctions regime against Syria could be somehow broken by the regional actors, such as Emirates or others? Because of, as far as I understand from your speech, the sanctions regime was initiated by Americans to prevent their allies, or to prevent Europeans and the Emiratis and others to engage with Syria.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, for your two questions. We'll start from the first one. Well, Iran, originally Syria, has been playing a vital role in Iranian plans, original political military plans to create sheer aggression from Iran to Lebanon through Iraq and Syria. And definitely now there are no resources enough for fulfilling these plans. And after easing possibly sanctions, anti-Iranian sanctions from the US, nobody knows what will be exact results of that, but probably this will be good for Iran in terms of fulfilling their important plans for themselves, egoistic plans in the region. As for Syria, it could have been good in terms of Iran's role in economic reconstruction. So it could bring more Iranian aid in terms of restoring and modernizing the Syrian industry, for example, critical infrastructure, etc. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, that could be that could make no good for Syria in terms of confrontation with Israel, because that will place more and more Syria in terms of possible Israeli attacks against Syria on Iranian facilities and pro-Iranian facilities inside Syria. And also, until now, we have been having like a division of roles between Russia and Iran in Syria. But more Iran and Syria could mean more competition with Russia, and I don't mean only economy, because economy here is a locomotive, could have been locomotive for more competition and, for instance, in political circuits and business circles and military circles. So that can bring more instability for Syria inside, and turmoil in Syrian elites split between pro-Russian sympathizers and pro-Iranian sympathizers. So that's a very tricky issue. As for your second question, I would like to say that, well, much will depend the future, will much depend upon reaching consensus between powers. Because I do not believe that any force, economic force, even from the Arab Gulf, can cope with the problem of Syria's gigantic, cyclopic reconstruction needs. There are some calculations reaching even like $700 billion US needed for the reconstruction of the country. So here we drastically need consensus, international consensus, not like about Lebanon, for instance, like monetary funds, France or the World Bank taking care of Lebanon. No one can just play such a role for Syria alone. So that will mean that much will depend upon improvements of the Syrian peace process, and definitely about the constitutional process. So this is important. Until now, there are no signs, positive signs in that direction. For example, amidst Russia's unsuccessful attempts, in my personal view, to persuade Arabs and Europeans to invest into Assad Syria before reaching a consensus political settlement of the crisis. Although Ambassador was absolutely right saying about that the coexistence with Assad, well, that's a reality, and people, they do understand that. So at the same time, I would like just to draw your attention to one more very important thing. And here I'm optimistic, a little bit optimistic, because it's not like about funding the reconstruction. It's also about the recovery of critical infrastructure in oil and gas, for instance. And here I would like to say that there are no other alternative than to re-establishing ties across the country, economic ties, even officially not reaching a political settlement. Because if you have your oil deposits and you do not have pipelines working, that you need to reach an agreement with the government in order to make them functional and to gain your profits. There is no other option, probably with Russian assistance, with the Iranian assistance whatsoever, even in Turkish assistance. There were some plans, you know, by Erdogan about that, some initiatives. But nevertheless, I'm sure that especially under the Caesar Act, there are no perspective that 1, 2, or 5 Arab Gulf countries or Arab countries will succeed in pushing Syria, really pushing ahead in terms of a large-scale economic reconstruction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's there are important points made. I think that definitely in the end we hope together with you that in the end it is about re-establishing ties, economic ties across the country. But you know, the current state of affairs is quite another. Anyway, I would like to come back to Ambassador Abhyankar. Ambassador, I think for the last question and some maybe last closing remarks from you on your book. In your book, I also read, I would like to just make this quote. Throughout history, notwithstanding its relatively small size, Syria, Ambassador, you're right, Syria, with its multifaceted character, became pivotal in influencing the direction of the region. What do you see, what do you think of the current dynamics and the future for Syria and the region? And maybe some closing remarks in your assessment of Syria as a pivotal state.
Thank you very much. Let me first say that I've benefited greatly from the comments made by both Dr. Khebnikov and Dr. Matev. I wish I had had an interaction with them before I finalized the book, but anyway, that is maybe a second book can be written. I would like to, of course, use this opportunity to say that I hope that I can remain in touch with both of you, sirs. Now, as far as where does Syria head after all this? The situation is not easy, and there is going to be a need for simultaneous action on many different areas, starting with action as far as President Assad is concerned, so that he's softened up in order to do this. This is the real problem. I found the same problem in Sri Lanka, just briefly to say that it was exactly the same thing. Once the Sri Lankan government actually defeated the liberation tigers of Tamil Eelam in the north of the country, who were continuing with their insurgency for almost 15 years. At that point, it became victor's justice. They said, now we are not going to negotiate anything. You take what we give us. I hope that as far as Syria is concerned, if we don't reach a situation where the President Assad says that, okay, now I've won, I'll give you what I can. What I can't, I won't. That is the worst possible solution or situation that we can find ourselves in. The reason why this may not happen is because the future of Syria does not depend on Syria alone. It depends on a large number of countries who have a stake there. And that is the guarantee that it should be possible to get some kind of a bargain worked out, where not only do the people, I'm not talking of getting a democracy in the ways India is or maybe the United States is, but at least people get some way in which they can participate in governance of the country within whatever limits are set. So, and the second thing, what is important to me is to keep Syria as it is, mainly because Syria is a country of minorities, and we should be able to keep them as they are in a secular way, although the secularism itself has helped the Alawites. But that apart, the rest of the Middle East has now gone completely Islamic. And the last thing we want is the same thing happens in Syria. So it is a big job because you're fighting against a tide. But I hope that after 2021 election, it is possible to move a little bit more in a positive way. Thank you. I think I missed some point.
No, that's okay. Thank you very much, Ambassador. We had all points here. Well, I would like to also thank, and we are very grateful to our those who watched us today via the Russian International Affairs Council's YouTube channel. And we also had this presentation of the book of Ambassador Abhyankar presented via Facebook on our webpage. I would like to mention in the end that we had today a presentation of a book, Syria, the Tragedy of a Pivotal State, of Professor of Practice of Diplomacy and Public Affairs of O'Neill's School of Public and Environment Affairs, Indiana University, Ambassador of the Republic of India to the Syrian Arab Republic, retired ambassador, Ambassador Abhyankar. We also had very great speakers with us today, Alexei Khlebnikov, who is an expert at the Russian International Affairs Council, and Igor Matveyev, who is well expert at the Russian International Affairs Council and senior research fellow of the Institute of Oriental Studies at the Russian Academy of Sciences and lecturer of MGIMO University of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Russia. So I would like to again thank our experts, thank Ambassador and all who watched us online. Thank you very much. And here, I think we end our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much to the Russian International.
Good day, all of you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.